I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. We're bringing together experts, thinkers, and leaders, busting myths, sharing stories, and staying connected when Canadians need it the most. We're having unexpected conversations for unprecedented times. Hi, everyone. Today we are speaking to a leading business expert and president and CEO of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Perrin Beatty. Hi, Perrin. How are you?
Hi, Tamara. Glad to be with you.
Really nice to see you and to talk with you. I'm hoping we can, chat about the economic impact of COVID and, where we're heading, where we are right now. This is, we're dealing with something that is, killing hundreds of thousands of people around the world. And, people are also worried about money and jobs and rightfully so. So I don't even know where to dig in, but why don't we start with what you're seeing? I mean, things are changing from week to week. So where are you at right now?
Well, this is, for all of us, it's an unprecedented event in our lifetimes. None of us have lived through anything like this. Perhaps the closest that any of us have had to endure before was the post 9/11 experience, where we were concerned about invisible killers in our midst. It had a dramatic effect upon how organizations functioned, how the economy was functioned, how governments organized themselves, and it was long lasting. The impact of COVID is even more profound. More people are affected around the world. The impact on the global economy is even more severe. And it's likely to be even more long lasting in terms of how it reshapes our society.
So, people always say, to predict the future, just look at our past. And so COVID it gets compared to, 1918 a lot, right? And, we're heading into a depression. Do you see that happening? Or, how do you think we're doing in Canada economic wise?
Well, it's important to learn from our past, but not to assume that the future is simply going to replicate the past. There are all sorts of lessons we can learn from previous pandemics or from other global economic crises. But each one is unique at the end of the day, and we have to be careful about being generals fighting the last war. We have to adapt ourselves to where we are today. And where are we today? We are in the worst contraction in the global economy since the Great Depression. And this is serious. The fundamentals, though, in the economy are different from the fundamentals that caused the Great Depression. This is caused by an external event, and that is a pandemic. It's a disease. It's one that we hope we'll be able to manage. And so it's not entirely analogous to when we were in the Depression, although there are still lessons that we can learn. If I were to take stock as to how we've done so far, all of us have been learning as we've been going along. Nobody anticipated the speed and the scope of this particular pandemic. Governments have had to make it up on the fly, and businesses have had to retool on the fly and to look at how they organize themselves. And we talk often about the so-called new normal. We won't even know what the new normal looks like until we have an effective vaccine that's in wide distribution. And the likelihood on that is that it will take 1 to 2 years before we have that, which means that we're going to have to move from a situation where governments around the world put the global economy and global societies into a medically induced coma. And we're going to have to move to a different standard, and that's living with the disease in our midst and being able to minimize the risks. That's where the 9/11 analogy comes up again. We recognized after 9/11, the first inclination the Americans had was shut everything down, shut the border down. We've got to cut ourselves off from the world because we're under attack. And all of us discovered that you simply couldn't do that over the long term, that the economic and social consequences of cutting yourself off from the world played into the hands of the terrorists. It was imposing an economic blockade on yourself. And so Canada in particular took the position on the management of the Canada-US border that we had to move from a concept of zero risk to risk management. How do we reduce the risk of another incident? how do we use our resources well, that we're targeting the resources at the areas of highest risk as opposed to spreading them evenly across the board? And how do we also build our resiliencies, that if there were another incident, that our economies and our societies would be able to recover from it more rapidly, and that the terrorists couldn't beat us? Same principles apply here. We've got to accept the fact that we're going to have to live with this disease in our midst. The good news is that we've made great progress in terms of beginning to bring down the rate of infection in Canada and in many other countries around the world. In some countries, it's still going up. But in Europe, for example, it has come down. And in places like Japan, South Korea, other countries like that, they've made, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, they've made good progress. So we can learn, and we're continuing to learn, how to manage the disease. Even domestically here, we've put new processes in place. So when this started, most of us weren't certain as to whether it was safe to go out and get groceries.
Mm-hmm.
Supermarkets, drugstores, and others have put in place procedures that enable us to go on with the essentials of life. And what we need to do at this point then is to look at how do we target our resources so that we're better protecting persons with pre-existing conditions or the elderly, that we put more resources there. And then what can we do in terms of ensuring that there's adequate testing and tracing? What can we do in terms of distribution of personal protective equipment? What can we do in terms of protocols in our workplaces?
But do you think we've done a good job with that? I mean, I look at what's happening in long-term care facilities. I look at what's happening for people with disabilities in this country. And I worry that, we're maybe, we're missing the mark on that a bit.
There's much more to be done. And
yes,
it's a matter of learning. All of us, when we looked at a long-term facility or at seniors' residence, all of us instinctively thought before, these are the safest places in the world to be, because so much care is taken in terms of protecting the safety of the elderly or of persons with disabilities, with needs. We discovered instead that these were particularly vulnerable places, and it's meant that we've had to completely retool. Governments and society as a whole have had to retool how we approach the dangers and where we put our resources and how we manage these organizations.
Yeah.
So we need to do much better. We don't have all the answers as yet. This is an evolving process, but the good news is we're getting more of the answers, and we are learning how to manage the disease in a way that we had no idea of just 3 months ago.
Right. It's interesting to, because, when I think about it, I hear you say we're learning and listen, I think that in BC, we're doing very well here. We've, it's been amazing compared to other places in Canada. And, when we look to the South and we see what's happening, where their rates are going up, and it's, they've handled this pandemic in a very different way than we have in this country. It's hard.
BC is the stellar case of how to do it.
Yes. So of course we want to stay the way we are, right? But I worry when we're learning as we're going, as we make mistakes in our learning, because you do make mistakes when you learn, the consequences of that learning are greater because we're talking about lives lost, right? So it's not just about, it's about money, and it's about health, and it's about, there's so many things wrapped up in this pandemic that it actually is hard to comprehend how much is at stake here.
Absolutely. And, again, the analogy to 9/11 applies. Terrorism isn't dead. It still exists in the world, and there's still a threat to ordinary citizens every single day. And it's silent and invisible and in our midst, the potential danger. And we've made mistakes. There have been other incidents that have taken place, but by and large, we've learned from the experience, and we've been able to manage the threat that's been posed by terrorism. And we haven't seen another 9/11.
Right. But my chances of getting COVID are greater than my chances of being in a terrorist attack.
Yes, but I guess
you know what I mean?
That the issue is the same.
Right.
That there's no
Right.
such
We
thing as
learn
zero
as
risk.
we, right.
There is no zero risk. There's
Mm,
nothing that we can do. We cannot leave the economy and society. We can't say to people, you're going to have to be locked up for the next 2 years. It won't work. So
no.
then we have to move to the issue of uh, accepting the fact that we're going to be living with this. How do we manage it? How do we reduce the risk? And how do we do so most effectively? And it also means that with the resources that we have, no society is rich enough that it can simply waste resources and spread it like jam across the board. We need to target the resources. If people with pre-existing conditions, or if seniors are the ones who are most at risk, let's add resources there and do a better job there. And then let's look at other ways in which we can manage it in our workplaces and elsewhere. So use those resources well. At the front end, where we simply didn't understand what we were dealing with, governments had no choice but to shut everything down. It was the same way as the Americans shut down access to the United States. Now where we're learning more, we can have a much more tailored, effective, nuanced response. And just going back to BC, I'm a former Minister of National Health and Welfare.
Yes.
I watched as this came ashore in Canada. It came first into Seattle, and we watched what was happening there. And British Columbians and Canadians were terribly worried about the spilling across the border. And the first instance that we had that was marked in Canada that everybody was watching was in a seniors' residence in Vancouver. And all of us thought that because this was entirely new to Canada, we had seen what had happened in Italy. We were watching the issue spread in Washington State. Uh, the great fear that we had was this would sweep through British Columbia, and particularly among seniors. BC proved to be the poster child in Canada for how you deal with the disease. And your infection rates have been low throughout all of this. You have managed it within seniors' residences and so on. And it's an example of how intelligent public policy responses can make a very real difference in terms of public health and safety.
Hmm. I was going to say you were elected to the House of Commons in the early 70s. So
72.
1972. So I mean, when you mentioned the spreading money like jam, um, you know, I find it fascinating. We're giving out money here, giving out money there, and for some people, it's too much. Stop this. Stop paying people. This is ridiculous. And other people, it's like, this is not enough. This is not, I mean, this is probably the story of your life, hearing these two different sides. Uh, do we need to, how do you feel about things like, a universal, pay, a wage? How do you feel about things like that? Are we heading in a way? Do you think our country is heading in a way to do that? Or how do you give people something, Perrin, and then take it away? How do we give people with disabilities here in BC an extra $300 a month, and then after, 3 or 4 months, take that back and throw them back into poverty? I mean, the $300 is not lifting them out of poverty, but do you know what I mean? How do we do that?
This is one of thousands of very tough questions that we're going to have to resolve as a society, and that our political leaders are going to have to provide leadership on. I don't believe the government's had any choice but to shut everything down when the disease first came ashore. But it was abundantly clear that to do that without having in place support programs for both individuals, for families, and for businesses would be a disaster. That you would simply create such incredible hardship that we would not recover from it. And so the governments at all levels had to bring in programs which would enable Canadians to make their way from the shore that they were on as COVID landed to the other side of the river. And we are doing that. We are starting to move into the process of decontrol, of reopening our economy, and so on. The issue is where we go from here. The first lesson is that you can't end all of these programs overnight. There's still going to be a need for many of them, but we have to make a transition from a subsidies-based economy where the government is writing the checks to one in which both families and businesses become self-sufficient, can support themselves, are paying taxes and paying the bills. The federal government alone has made promises so far, according to the Parliamentary Budget Officer, of over $250 billion. It's a figure that our minds can't even get around. And this is going to be paid for by an economic infrastructure that has been heavily damaged by the disease and by the shutdown. And the temptation for our generation is simply say, well, we'll go ahead and we'll spend and pass the bill to our kids. I don't think that's responsible. I think we have to come to grips with it. So the challenge now becomes, how do you begin the process of reopening and of transitioning away from subsidies to self-sufficiency? Where do you have to maintain programs, and what are the most effective ones for ensuring that families and individuals and businesses are able to manage? It means then at the public policy level that we don't go back to the pre-COVID agenda in January. We need to ask ourselves, where do we have to be now? Where are the changes that we have to make? What is it that we can do that allows growth in our economy again and allows us to grow out of this debt burden and to afford the things that we need to do? Move away from the nice to haves that all of us would have loved to have had under different circumstances. Focus on the must haves of growing the economy, making sure people have jobs, making sure families can pay their bills.
Let's talk about jobs a bit, because I mean, small business and these big businesses too, right? Like I tend to think about small businesses a little bit more because I have lots of friends that own, small restaurants in the city or little clothing shops, and these small businesses are, they're so important to our neighborhoods, our community. Many of them aren't going to make this. They're not going to make it, Perrin. And so what happens when, the rent in Vancouver, as you know, commercially and residentially, is through the roof. So if you're a small restaurant in Vancouver, your rent is $20,000, which I think is pretty cheap here, and you're not getting anybody in, and takeout isn't doing it for you. How are we to protect our small businesses?
Well, and that's the critical issue, Tamara. 98% of the businesses in Canada are SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses. The other 2% are the large companies that we often think of. If you look at the restaurant sector that you cited, in the best of times and in good times, the average margin that a restaurant would have in being, when it's successful, is between 4 and 6% of sales. That's an extremely tight margin. These aren't the best of times. It is impossible to think of a business plan that if you take half the seats out of a restaurant because of social distancing, that you can keep the restaurant in business. The other challenge for SMEs is that SMEs aren't cash rich. We surveyed people along with Statistics Canada at the beginning of the lockdowns and had a sense as to where companies were. For most small businesses, the maximum that they had cash reserves for were 2 to 3 months maximum, and many of them didn't have that much. So a high percentage of our small businesses were put in jeopardy by this. Rental, the cost of rent, the cost of other fixed costs they have of inventory. Look at a clothing store that hasn't been able to sell the rest of its winter inventory, has had in its summer inventory, and is apt to miss the summer season, is ordering in fall inventory now. How do they pay the bills for doing that? Look at the travel sector and tourism. We are within a few weeks of losing the whole of the summer tourist season, which is where the vast bulk of tourist revenues come in. And that's every community in Canada that's affected. It's restaurants, it's hotels, it's festivals, it's other attractions, it's taxis, it's airlines, and so on. Our airlines have seen 90 to 95% of their business disappear. And that will have to be rebuilt. Vancouver International Airport normally would have about 22,000 people working there every day. When you have just 2 or 3,000
Yeah.
or people going through the airport, you can think of the impact with the shops, the restaurants, the taxis, all of the ancillary businesses. And so the economic damage here is enormous, which means that A, we have to reopen the economy and allow people to restart and do so in a way that's safe. Your starting point has to be public health. Nobody will come to a restaurant or come to a store or come to your business to as an employee unless they believe it's safe to do so. So we have to focus on that up front, but have in place plans for a safe reopening with timetables on them. And we have to have programs that are tailored in the short term to assist particularly small businesses to make it to the other side of the river.
Should we be worried about these big businesses too? I think that sometimes we get in this mind frame where we're like, oh, the small businesses, they're locally owned, support locals, support small business. These big businesses, they're fine. They're rich. They have lots of money. They can handle it. But they also employ, thousands of people, some of them.
Absolutely. And so look at the airlines. I was mentioning them earlier, where you have a 95% drop in passenger volumes, and you still have fixed costs that you have to pay. This is an incredible hemorrhaging of money in that sector, and it can't continue indefinitely. We are likely around the world to see a number of airlines that all of us know of going out of business. So that's just one example, but we have read coming out of the States and elsewhere, retail chains closing their stores or declaring bankruptcy, and thousands of people being put out of work as a consequence. You look in Canada at restaurant chains that may have 100 or 150 operations across the country. All of them have been hurting. It's not just the local operation, the national operation as well. Is affected.
So where does the responsibility lie, do you think, on those? Like, I'm just thinking of some friends who have a restaurant here, and their landlord, who's very wealthy, developer in town, right, has a building. It did not apply for the rent relief for businesses. And so they can't, I don't understand how it all works, but now this restaurant can't apply for the help from the guy. And this is happening everywhere. These, bigger landlords are just like, whatever, you're on your own. Like, I'll give you a break for this, but then that's it. Where does the responsibility lie?
It lies with all of society, and all of us are going to have to be involved if we're going to make it successful. It means businesses retooling and developing new business strategies. It means governments providing assistance, and it means that landlords as well have to recognize the fact that so many of their tenants are in dire straits. I do believe, in speaking with them, that the majority of very large national landlords are going to go into the federal government's program. One of the challenges for them, though, is that they have to certify that every one of their tenants for whom they would receive the rental subsidy qualifies. And they're incapable of looking in and knowing the financials of each one of the tenants. This could be literally thousands of businesses they would have to certify. The government maintains for itself the right to come back for 2 or 3 years and audit after the fact. And if they find that a particular tenant wasn't qualified, the landlord is on the hook to repay the subsidy. And the program itself is cumbersome in terms of the paperwork that's involved. The provinces and the federal government need to sit down and need to look at how to fix this. In some cases, provinces have also taken their own measures and declared eviction moratoriums for a specified period of time to try to give some assurance to retailers that they're able to stay in place. But property owners across the country are among the big businesses that are going to be very badly hit by this. Look at what we're doing today and having this conversation remotely. All of our businesses have retooled. We've gone to remote working. And as I've talked to CEOs across the country, almost all of them have said, we're not going back to the same model we had before. We'll still have offices, but we're going to use also a mixed office with distributed workforce across the country, use telecommunications to be able to tie it in. You can imagine for people who have large blocks of property, this is going to be exceptionally difficult for those companies as well. So uh, every sector is feeling it and trying to respond in its own way.
Yeah, it's very, it's like peeling an onion. You just peel off one layer and then it's like, oh my gosh, now we have to deal with this layer. And because there are so many, why would I go downtown and buy, whatever it is I have to buy when I can do it online
Yep.
and have it delivered to my house? And I don't have to risk my health or anything like that moving forward. Will it all change, Perrin, when and if there is a vaccine? Does that change everything?
Uh, you mean, is the new normal going to look like the old normal?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Well, the new normal will look more like the old normal than what we have today, but we are not going back to where we were. And some of this is good. Look at your company, TELUS, and the
I wish it was my company. I'm just a host of a podcast.
look at the work that TELUS does in terms of
Yeah,
digital health and digital agriculture. One of
right.
the effects of this has been to accelerate a trend that was already taking place in society,
Mm,
and that is the digitalization of society. Um, we are improving services that are available for Canadians in health as a result of doing this. We don't want to go back to where we were before. If you can consult your doctor through video link and it's not necessary to be in the office, so much the better, or to have your prescription renewed that way. If people in rural and remote areas are able to get jobs with companies that are located in urban centers, that's a good thing. If
yes.
companies are able to retool and to use the skills of senior citizens who otherwise would be retired, that's a good thing. So, what I've talked to some Japanese business people, and they said, look, the approach that we have to take is the same as Japan took after the tsunamis, where they said the goal isn't to go back to where we were; it's to go to something better. And every organization and society as a whole has to realize that all of us would have given our right arms not to have had society go through this. But our goal shouldn't be to go back to where we were. Our goal should be to go to something better. And we need to have a vision and a determination to do that. It won't be easy. There'll be a lot of hardship along the way. But we started this discussion with you mentioning previous pandemics. One of the things that came out of previous pandemics was public health sanitation. To avoid pandemics, you had to have proper sewer systems and water purification. And that transformed the whole nature of our societies. As we moved away from having horses and the problems with manure and animal wastes in city streets, of people throwing human waste out of the window into the street, uh, that was driven in part both by advances in technology and by the public health need to avoid more disease. Um, this will transform our society. Exactly how it will, we don't know at this point, but we should be determined to make sure it transforms it for the better.
Yes, absolutely. What about our border? What about our Canada-U.S. relations? What about its? I think when people think about reopening it, we look at what's happening in the U.S. with COVID. They don't seem to have control over it at all, and everything's reopening there, and we're seeing the effects of that in how many cases every single day in so many states. It's very different how we are handling it, the two countries, but yet our border remains closed. When we open it, what happens? Is it better economically but worse for us health wise? What are your
I think
thoughts on
whether
that?
certainly we're sustaining serious problems as a result of having the border closed. The impact on the economy is significant, and the impact on families and others just wanting to get back with their ordinary lives is significant. And we're seeing, for example, in Europe, borders being reopened there within Europe and also with many other countries around the world. Public health comes first. We want to make sure that it's safe. If I could bring us back to the analogy of post 9/11 again,
Hmm.
um, we recognized we couldn't keep the border closed indefinitely. We had to reopen. But there's the ability where a threat takes place to increase security along the border and to close it down entirely if it's necessary to do so. Instead of looking at the 49th parallel simply as one line that you have to have the same policy everywhere, we should be looking at how are people using the border, and is there a particular risk between North Dakota and Canada? Or is Washington State managing it well and can have good relationships with British Columbia? Or is there a serious outbreak in Detroit or in New York State that would affect Ontario and Quebec? Be more nuanced in what we're doing. Similarly, when we're looking at people coming in from abroad, we should be looking at what country are they coming in from? Have they been in a place in the last 2 weeks where the infection rate is high, in which case you would have tougher regulations or restrictions on the ability to come in? But in many instances, they would be coming in from countries where the infection rate is lower than in Canada, where the risk of meeting that person getting off a plane would be lower than meeting a Canadian getting onto a plane. So again, the lesson here is instead of using the blunt instrument that we have of just shut everything down, it's how do we tailor the response to the circumstances that we're dealing with in a way that's intelligent. And fortunately, we're reaching the stage now where we can do that.
Yes, and as we wrap up, Perrin, this has been fascinating to talk to you about all of this. What is we're in June. What will our economy look like for the rest of the year?
It's let me take it over 2 years. By the end of next year, we will likely not be back to where our economy was on the 1st of January of this year. And so it means we're going through a very difficult period. People talk about a so-called V-shaped recovery, that we drop precipitately, will bounce back up. Or you hear about a U-shaped recovery where there's a flatter bottom and a slower return. The answer is it's going to vary from sector to sector and from region to region. Some sectors have done very well. Some of the high-tech sector has done very well because of digitalization. Other sectors like travel, tourism, the hospitality sector, the restaurants you were talking about earlier, are going to be going through a very difficult period for some considerable period of time. And we're going to have to be working with them over some time. It really highlights the fact that the single most important thing we can do is to have a tailored strategy in place to reopen our economy. We need a timetable for that so that people can plan. And with the full understanding that we say this is the timetable for reopening the border, barring there being some force majeure, some catastrophic event that demonstrates it's unsafe for us to do so, in which case we will go back. We may have to reimpose restrictions in some cases, but give people a planning framework. So if you had an airline, as we were talking about earlier, if the government were to say today, 0 travel restrictions, you can bring in people from anywhere in the world, you would have to start calling back your employees. You'd have to start testing equipment, and you'd have to start getting the supplies that you need. You'd have to get airports up to speed, and you would have to start marketing seats on the plane. Imagine how long it would take, even with 0 restrictions, before you were actually up and running on any sort of a reasonable level. Without a timetable, you can't even start.
Yeah.
Who will sign a contract on anything? If you were running a festival in Vancouver, a music festival, and you didn't know whether public gatherings were going to be permitted, would you sign a contract to bring in a musical group?
No.
No.
No,
And
you
so
can't.
you have to have a degree of certainty, and so bring in strategies to make sure this can be done safely. Bring in a timetable with a clear understanding that we can't predict all of the circumstances here. If circumstances change, public health comes first, and we'll have to adapt. But at least give some degree of certainty that allows people to plan.
Yeah, and I feel like we have that in British Columbia. I feel like Dr. Henry has done a very good job at that. We have, we know what the different phases are and what they mean. My husband's a musician, and when we watched the different phases, he said to me, "Okay, so I won't work again until there's a vaccine. I'm phase 4. Or phase 5 or whatever it is. He's the very last one, his job."
Yep.
So
And
at
that's
least
for
we
sure.
know that we're in trouble until there's a vaccine. You know what I mean, in this family. So
Well, and that's the case that as we look at the tourism sector, for example, some elements of the tourism sector you could open up today. You're opening up in BC and in many other parts of the country they're doing as well. They're opening up parks.
mhm.
Makes sense to do that. Can we open up beaches as long as we have social distancing? Yes, we can. Can we start to open up museums and have social distancing there and art galleries? Yes, we can. Can we look at some music events where you're able to spread people out? Yes, we can. Can you pack uh, thousands and thousands of people into BC Place right now and have a music festival? No, you can't. But it means that you need to have a tailored, nuanced response.
Right. Yeah. Custom, as you tailored custom. Yeah. I can definitely wrap my head around that. What would you, and as we wrap up, Perrin, what can somebody like, what can the average person do to help support, our small businesses? How can we help as, as a community? How can we help each other? What do you think the best way to do that is?
Well, there are ways with restaurants now, for example, some of them are starting to reopen, at least for across Canada for patios and the like. Many of them have takeout, and we can uh, patronize them, particularly with the takeout, for example. This doesn't give them the self-sustaining business plan that they need, but it at least provides some cash flow for them. The same with retailers. Many of them have gone online. There's more that government can do as well to assist businesses to go online, and we can do shopping there. We're starting to reopen retail operations across the country. Uh, we need to give the reassurance to Canadians that it will be safe in the same way as they feel safe to go to the supermarket, for them to be able to go to other stores. In doing that, if we can restore people's confidence by working together, we can start to get the cash flowing through these smaller businesses, and that's absolutely critical for us to do. They're important to us not simply for dollars and cents reasons, but they define who we are as a community, the character of our communities. Vancouver is such a great example of that. Whenever I visit Vancouver, there's so many unique retailers, so many unique manufacturers, so many unique cultural experiences there that define who you are as a province and as a community. And if we were to lose those, we would be losing something that was intrinsic to who we are as Canadians.
Wow. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. I've learned a lot, and I could keep talking to you, but we've been talking for quite a while here, and you're amazing. And I hear that you're quite you like to tweet, so I encourage everybody to follow you on Twitter. You can follow Perrin on Twitter. It is at Perrin Beatty. That's PERRIN. Beatty. And you can find out more information about the Canadian Chamber of Commerce at chamber.ca. And be sure to join us here on TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart every single week. Thanks so much, Perrin.
Thanks, Tamara. Glad to be with you.